It might take all the strength I got.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
And I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Wednesday, February 22nd, 2023. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Malcolm Harris, author of Palo Alto, A History of California, Capitalism, and the World. Meanwhile, the EPA has officially ordered Norfolk Southern to clean up their mess, particularly the contaminated soil underneath the tracks, which they were not addressing. They just wanted to start running trains over it again. State Senator Jennifer McClellan has won the special election in Virginia's 4th, a safe blue district. She will be the first black woman to represent the state in Congress. And another special election is coming, this time in Rhode Island. Another bluer district, but one of the state's 2 representatives is resigning. David Cicilline. John Tester will seek re-election for Montana's Senate seat. That is good news for Democrats in 2024. The Biden administration has announced an awful new border crackdown when Title 42 expires in May. Migrants will be eligible for asylum, or ineligible, I should say, if they cross illegally. So, Joe, they're still going to say that you love open borders. The grand jury in the Georgia case against Trump's attempt to steal the election has recommended multiple indictments. Fascinating. A federal judge in Michigan has ruled against Starbucks, forcing them to reinstate a fired worker and a cease and desist, or an injunction, on union busting nationwide. This is the first ruling of its kind, apparently, in decades. Israeli forces have killed at least 10 Palestinians, including a teenager, an elderly man, in the occupied West Bank a few hours ago. That makes over 60 this year so far, including over a dozen children. We fund this. Speaking of Israel, the right-wing Supreme Court has made sure that criticism of Israel remains repressed. They've left in place an Arkansas law that requires state contractors to pledge not to boycott Israel. SCOTUS also refused to hear Mississippi's racial gerrymandering case. So the primary results are in for the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, which will determine district maps, abortion rights, and more. Democrat Janet Protasewicz moves on to face right-wing Daniel Kelly in the general, which is in 6 weeks. And lastly, the Seattle City Council has outlawed caste discrimination. Thank you, as always, Kshama Sawant. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome to the show, everybody. It is just myself and Bradley today. Matt is out for just like 1 day, scheduled day off. So, lots of my voice. Enjoy that. I am contractually obligated to inform you that it is also hump day. Still not seeing the proportionate residuals for that phrase, but alas. And for those of you just tuning in, Sam is out this week as well. Matt will be with us the rest of the week. We're kind of shuffling chairs around on MR this week.
Yeah, there might have been a little bit of an issue with the theme song, but you sound fine. Sorry about that, guys. I don't know. It might have been a noise canceling thing that Matt did because of the construction. But you sound and we sound okay. But I just wanted to flag that for people.
No.
Yeah, sorry about that. Our mics are fine though.
Oh, I couldn't hear that.
Yeah, sorry about that. It's you came through completely clearly. It's just there might just be an issue with the noise canceling, but we will see.
Okay.
If we have to take a break or anything, we will. But
all right.
About that, guys.
All right. Well, as long as I sound good. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay. Again, skeleton crew today. Bradley's doing a bunch of different jobs. So let's turn to this first. So Governor Ron DeSantis is doing his crime tour across America as a way to just keep stacking different achievements, Pokemon cards against wokeness. I don't even know what to say. He's tripling down, quadrupling down on just standard right-wing culture war issues. To an extent, I mean, that's what the base cares about, right? That they're the Tea Party era where they pretended to be fiscal responsibility conservatives isn't not hitting the same, right? So DeSantis is going all in on it. But at the same time, he's not addressing Trump, who is calling him out on a daily basis, trash talking him, and he looks weak. That paired with his other lack of charisma, that paired with the fact that it seems like he's kind of a one-trick pony on some of these issues, it's not looking good for DeSantis in my view, and he still has not officially decided if he's going to even run. We have this poll later, and we'll touch on it, but Trump is still leading the field in a morning consult poll of Republican primary candidates by like a significant margin. The entire media apparatus was telling us that the Republican Party has moved on from Trump, and Morning Consult has him at 50% in a national poll, and DeSantis at 30. That's 20 points. Meatball run. And here he is on his crime tour again. I don't, if he's not going to run, I'm not exactly sure what this is for. But he spoke in Chicago at an event with the, of course, Chicago Police Union about wokeness.
The reason why you have crime that has spiraled out of control in so many of these different areas is because you have politicians putting woke ideology ahead of public safety. And you see it now. I know in Chicago, you have all these candidates. They're all trying to out-woke each other. The left of the left is where they run. And then they end up running on these platforms that destroy the communities they're elected to represent.
Yeah, again, wokeness, when you hear that, just know that Republicans know they can't say blackness, so they use wokeness. It's a substitute. Just like when Trump was trying to go after Black Lives Matter protesters, but knew he couldn't really say it without just setting off every alarm bell about racism in this country and his own racism, he would lose his plausible deniability. That's what the wokeness substitute for blackness is there. And it's fitting, of course, that he says it to a police union that, seems to be all in with the message that DeSantis is presenting to them. The voters, I'm not so sure. This is J.P. Pritzker's response, the governor of Illinois. Often considered and spoken about as a presidential hopeful, especially if Biden doesn't run. But if Biden does run, I could see it totally in 2028. He is a billionaire. We should note that. There are no good billionaires. However, he's approaching decent billionaire status. He might carve out an exception for himself. He responded to DeSantis here. Some of his other, claims about wokeness in Illinois' education system that he's trying to shoehorn into the crime narrative. And I don't know if it ended up being a general election between these two guys. Here's an example of how Pritzker would wipe the floor with this charismaless, complete freak, Ron DeSantis.
The truth is that we actually have a much better education system in Illinois than they have in Florida. We're ranked higher than they are. U.S. News and World Report ranks K-12 education in Illinois 6th in the country and number 1 among the largest states in the country. So he's got nothing to brag about when it comes to education. So he moves on and tries to use this word woke to describe everything. He doesn't even know what the word means, and he has no definition of it. It's just anything he doesn't like is wokeism. And all I can tell you is that I don't know what that means. And frankly, what I can say about Illinois is that we're a state that cares about equity. We're a state that cares about our families. We're making the investments that are required so that our youngest children will do better and better. And I'm really excited about the direction of our state, as opposed to a state where they don't make the investments that are necessary to lift up their education system or their healthcare system.
Boom. That was pretty on point there. Not sure I could have said it any better. And the re-emphasis and the stating of investment as being key. I like that framing as well, frankly. And there needs to be more aggressive combating of the culture war nonsense that the right continues to gin up, because there's a vacuum left, honestly, by a lot of elected Democrats when it comes to things like what wokeness even means. I mean, there's no counter narrative from elected officials, and you have pretty much every Republican politician banging the tables to get wokeness out of our schools. That redefinition of what it means, just being anything you don't like, that's a good one. And also it being a dog whistle for just anything that is non-white patriarchal pro-power narratives in schools or elsewhere. That's another good framing for it. But that just perked my ears up a little, because there was a piece in Politico this morning about Pritzker and other presidential hopefuls. The Illinois Democrat, like everyone else, has offered his full support to Biden, but insiders note that senior advisors from his last 2 campaigns are still standing by just in case. Key among them is Quinton Folks, who's last year served as a campaign manager, blah, blah, blah. So he speaks about his staff that's, quote, ready to deploy. It's not a foregone conclusion that Biden runs again. I would say it's more likely than not. But either way, if it did end up coming down to a guy like DeSantis versus a guy like Pritzker, he's not the most progressive choice. He's not Bernie Sanders. He's not a squad member. But that was a little taste. I'm impressed by his ability to provide a decent and leveled attack against assholes like Ron DeSantis. All right, before we take a quick break and get to our interview with Malcolm Harris, which I'm incredibly excited for, this book is phenomenal, we have a word from one of our sponsors. I know Sam has spoken about this a lot, Aura, and how much he loves Aura, how helpful it's been in protecting his identity. It alerted him when he opened an account for his daughter, and it was comforting for him. I mean, look, he's neurotic. We all know this. And but even for the non-neurotic, Aura is quite helpful. Aura is an easy-to-use app that includes everything you need to stay safe online. It protects you from scammers and hackers by scanning the so-called dark web, where criminals sell stolen information looking for your emails, passwords, and social security numbers. Aura alerts you fast if it finds anything. I'm sure you guys have gotten emails. This password's been compromised. That password's been compromised. Aura takes care of that for you in one fell swoop. They help you fight back against those annoying websites that make your personal information public by automatically requesting removal of your info. This helps reduce robocalls. Those are annoying as hell. Aura gives you a near-time real alerts on suspicious credit inquiries, like if someone was opening a loan or credit card in your name. Their VPN allows you to stay anonymous online by keeping your browsing history and personal information safe and encrypted. And they protect your devices from viruses, malware, spyware, and more, so the bad guys can't break in. Aura even helps you manage what your kids can do on their devices. You can restrict specific apps, YouTube, or is Minecraft an app? I don't even know, but it seems like you might need to do that. I would like to have this when I have kids, I would imagine. Set screen time limits and even set focus times to ensure your child is doing their homework instead of binging YouTube. And their password manager lets you store and access your online passwords securely and conveniently. Maybe you already have an app that does one of these things, but with Aura, you don't have to download and pay for 7 separate apps. Like I said earlier, it's all consolidated into one easy-to-use service. Let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online. If you sign up right now, Aura will give you a 2-week trial for free. 2-week free trial with my link. You will be shocked at how much of your private information Aura finds exposed over that 2-week period. Go to aura.com, aura.com/majority, MAJORITY, to start your free trial. We also will have it linked below in the description, aura.com/majority, and you can also scan the QR code linked below, aura.com/majority. All right, quick break, coming back with Malcolm Harris. We are back, and we are joined now by Malcolm Harris, a journalist and author of Palo Alto, A History of California, Capitalism, and the World. Malcolm, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Emma.
This book, I know I like a lot of the books that we feature here on the Majority Report. Highly, highly recommend. I mean, after having read some of your book, I would imagine, Malcolm, you're in agreement that AI is going to be transformational, right?
Transformation for some people's bank accounts, I guess.
Exactly. So in your book, I mean, people might be surprised that it is not just a recent history of Silicon Valley kind of tech entrepreneurship. It makes this really compelling case for, well, by going through the history of California and that region of California, for why Palo Alto and Northern California in particular is like this paragon for American capitalism. And I think a lot of people would think of East Coast money centers first when they would think of areas of the country that epitomize United States money or monetary systems like Wall Street or something like that. But as you write, California really has been a laboratory for American extraction. What was your thought process behind that being so central to your analysis?
Yeah, when I started this project, I thought I would run into a lot of that when I was releasing the book, of people questioning, is Palo Alto really this important? Is it, sure, the tech industry is there, but is it a world historical center of capitalism in America? Surely you mean San Francisco, maybe you mean Los Angeles, but not Palo Alto. Now, only a few years later after that, I don't get that question nearly as much. The role of Palo Alto has been so self-explanatory, not just in this country, but in the world economy. And so this project allowed me to go back and find the origins of that, and really to see how people forgot that experience over and over again, that they've located the future and even the present of capitalism in California over and over again for 150 plus years. And then every 20 or so, they forget about it so they can find it all over again. Right.
I mean, and that kind of just makes it proves your point to a degree that it is in the DNA of the way it's structured there. I mean, your book doesn't just start at, as I mentioned, as just a history of like the tech boom. It really does begin with U.S. discovery in quotes of and the seizure of California. Let's start there with guys like John Fremont and the efforts from the federal government in the United States to capture California in the mid 1800s.
Yeah, so at this time, California is the furthest corner of the Western world, right? It's the very end of civilization as they understood it. No one wanted to go there. It was very thinly colonized, even by Mexico at that point, which had nominal control of the territory. Very thinly colonized. The Russians had looked at it, European powers had looked at it down from the Northwest Territory. But it's this wilderness as far as capitalist society, emerging capitalist society is concerned. Then with the location of gold and the gold strike in the mid 19th century, this sort of flips, right? You have the furthest corner of the world becoming the center of a new capitalist world. And from that very beginning, it was seeing high technology, high levels of education, and high levels of profit all tied together from that period. And we've seen it continue that strategy in the whole 170 plus years since.
Yeah. I mean, and Fremont in particular, do you mind telling his story, what Polk wanted him to do, and what that kind of expansion entailed?
Yeah, the colonization of Alta California by Anglo-Americans was established on the model of Texas, where you sort of send some guys in there to start fighting some stuff. And they have a layer of plausible deniability where if they lose, if they had lost to the Mexican garrisons in California, the U.S. federal government could have thrown up their hands and said, we don't know that guy. We don't know that guy Fremont and the bunch of dudes that he had with him. But if they succeed, which they are ultimately able to do due to how thinly colonized the area was by Mexico, then they can start including them as Americans and capturing the territory for the United States, which is what ends up happening. And so it's the colonization itself is this real synthesis of federal activity and grassroots vigilantism. And that synthesis, I think we can still see in California politics today.
Yeah, I mean, you can even see it in like the birth of Reaganism later on, and we can get to that as well. But I mean, the the mythology of like the gold rush, right? I mean, that was it's a much darker reality than a lot of the American mythology kind of frames it. Like you describe it as California as being a bit more akin to a colony because it was still a bit unwieldy amid the Civil War. How does that unique dynamic also inform California's kind of DNA?
Yeah, when I looked into antebellum Anglo-American California, which is really only this like 10-year period, more or less, the world analogs were pretty clear to me, but they weren't in the United States, right? It was countries like, or territories like Algeria or South Africa or Australia were the obvious analogs for California at that point. And that made me understand California, Alta California, as an overseas colony for the United States, which is really what it was until they established the Transcontinental Railroad, right? The fastest way around to California was through Central America up and around, right? By 2 boat trips. It was an overseas colony. Through the Transcontinental, it's brought into the continental United States, and the North American United States, as we come to understand it, is built through this activity, both by bringing in California and by establishing domination over the South. But these historical analogs really allow us to see California is in its global context instead of just in a national context, and see that its proximity to, say, like the Philippines ends up being very important for the 20th century, even more so than its relation to, say, Florida.
Right. Well, and to other areas like, Japan as well, as you touch on, and that almost pre-globalization, it was globalized before globalization, if that makes complete sense. So in terms of it being an example of American capitalism, right? That fits as well.
Well, it's this really last link of the chain in global capitalism. So when Leland Stanford and the other railroad associates start bringing over Chinese workers from the Pearl River Delta to finish building the railroad, right? They connect that line to China before they connect that line to the East Coast, right? And so when we look at now, we say like, oh, there's this relationship between China and California. We think about Apple and we think about Apple's relationship to China as a company, or California Industries' relationship to China. And like, again, that doesn't start in the 20th century. It doesn't start in the 60s. It doesn't start in the 80s. It starts in the 1870s. And
Right.
So that's where we need to be looking, earlier, 1850s, 1860s.
That tech mantra of moving fast and breaking things, how did that apply to, the seizure of California, the extraction, and particularly to the indigenous population? You mentioned Stanford there, and I want to talk about him in a bit, but that is equally foundational to the identity that you speak of.
Yeah, and that Anglo-American colonization of Alta California was destructive to the lifeways of the people who lived there in a way that even Spanish colonization couldn't have been, precisely because it was capitalist. So with the missions and Spanish colonization of California, it's not that it wasn't bad, but you had this feudal domination by the church, which wasn't able to incorporate all the indigenous people into some sort of labor relation. And so mostly people lived outside the mission and lived outside these colonial relations, even if their territory was impinged upon. When the Anglo-American colonists set up, they have to convert everything into capital, right? They have to convert everyone who lives there into workers. They need to convert all the rivers and water systems into rivers and water systems for hydraulic mining. They need to convert all the territory into potential mines. And in doing so, they destroy the possibility of any other society making a life according to different requirements in that same place, which means destroying millennia old societies that had endured Spanish colonization.
Right. I mean, and talk about some of those societies and also the enclosure of land during that period.
Yeah. And so you see, especially in the Northwest, the final colonization of Alta California territory and what we now understand is Indian killing campaigns by the early state government that were then financed by the national government. And so Klamath territory, let's say in the Northwest, is conquered by these Anglo-American settlers who, in exchange for their participation in these militia raids where they're just going and stealing territory, are then rewarded with that territory in exchange and in a legal format, right? And so this colonization, again, we see this relationship between grassroots vigilantism of white settlers in California with the federal government, which ends up financing what they call the Indian war bonds. And we're still seeing research from historians on these questions today, right? These are present objects of research.
And it was acknowledged even by Stanford University, right? The fact that the land that the university was built on is actually rightfully tribal land. And you actually, in your final chapter, you talk about how Stanford needs to be returning that land and in the form of reparations to one of the tribes that the tribe that had held it before colonization.
Yeah, the Muwekma Ohlone have a pretty clear claim to the territory. It's acknowledged by Stanford. It's a politically constituted organization that has clear anthropological evidence confirming its unbroken line in the territory that Stanford claims is Stanford territory. 8,000 acres of Stanford University that's remained unsold since the 19th century. So they preserved this land, in this time, not for the indigenous people to whom they acknowledge it belongs or from whom it was taken, but for themselves. And so for them to, and if you Google Stanford land acknowledgement and you go to that page, they have a link saying not only is land acknowledgement not enough, but we need to think about land back and what it means to go beyond acknowledgement. And they're using this as a rhetorical, they say oh, we need to go beyond rhetoric as a kind of rhetorical effort, which I find really funny because the practical effort is sitting right there. It's not very complicated.
Right. But at the same time, I mean, they're going to fight tooth and nail for that not to happen. That's a lot of what we see today, right? Recognition as opposed to compensation or any structural change, right?
It's true, but I think this presents, and maybe it's a provocation. Some people are thinking about it as a provocation rather than a pragmatic policy suggestion. And if that is the case, then so be it, right? If it is provocative, then it should provoke us to ask why this isn't just a pragmatic policy suggestion. What is particularly provocative about this suggestion versus some other difficult to accomplish? If someone says we would need to raise the unionization rate from under 10% to 25%, that's a pragmatic policy suggestion. But if I say give back 1,000 acres of this land that no one even owns in the first place, that's just a provocation. Why? What puts the one thing on one line and one thing on the other side of the line?
Well, capitalism, right? So I mean, let's talk about Stanford, the Leland Stanford, the namesake of that very university there, where birthed a lot of these vampires, and the founder of Stanford, Stanford was Leland Stanford, as you write. He led a railroad at one point as well, and he used this term called the Palo Alto system, which you talk about. What did that term mean?
Yeah, this is even before the school starts. Palo Alto is a stock farm for horses. And Leland Stanford, the one-time governor of the state, moves his family to the suburbs. And to do so, he has to invent the suburb because the suburb doesn't exist yet. So you invent the suburb to escape the class war of the city. And there he sets about reinventing the production of horses, specifically trotting horses, which at the time were the most important tool in American society. For transportation, for agriculture, for the military, used horses for everything. And he said, it takes too long to profit off the production of horses because you have to wait till they get old enough to run them very fast. And then you have to wait till their kids are old enough to run very fast to prove that their genetic material is worth selling. And so he and his head trainer, Charles Marvin, set up the largest horse training compound in the world. And they take inspiration from the early childhood education movement that's starting in Germany with these things called kindergartens. And so before there's any kindergarten for children in the West, there's a kindergarten for horses. And at the Palo Alto Stock Farm, they build what's called a kindergarten track, what they call a kindergarten track, where they're going to race horses as fast as they can, as young as they can. And this is a new form of training to speed up this production process. And they call this system the Palo Alto system. And it's incredibly effective for raising especially young, especially fast horses. And it sort of shocks the world how effective the system is. Now, horses are soon to be overtaken by tractors and other mechanized engines. And so horses don't become the foundation for Silicon Valley, right? We don't talk about Silicon Valley's great horse production system. But the logic that underlied the Palo Alto system has continued for the next 150 years to structure the thinking of people in Palo Alto and around Stanford University. So if you go to Palo Alto now and you say, you ask some entrepreneurs, what's the Palo Alto system? I think they'll make something up because they don't like admitting that they don't know things. But they don't know, right? They wouldn't be able to tell you about horses unless they read this excerpt in the Atlantic. But still, if you ask them about scaling, potential, heavy investment in experimental models or whatever, they recognize what they do in Palo Alto in this horse production system.
Right. And it's also notable, too, that for much of Leland Stanford's kind of entrepreneurial enterprises, there was a focus on making a great deal of money for himself, less for shareholders, and kind of breaking into the market. That's like Sam Bankman-Fried comes to mind as somebody who has continued that kind of legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And Leland Stanford we think of him as a more dignified version of it because he was a 19th century guy in his big suit and he was like a large man with his beard and he looked the part. But looking the part was really what his gig was. And the reason he became the front man for this group of associates is because he was the least clever and the least competent. And so they stuck him in front for people to yell at and for Congress to prosecute. Except he ends up dying basically before Congress gets around to investigating all the chicanery around the Transcontinental Railroad. So he sort of gets out scot-free, and the inheritance and the fortune ends up accruing to the university. And it's his wife, Jane Lathrop Stanford, who actually gets a referendum to exempt the school from taxation, which then becomes a model for all private universities to try and exempt themselves from taxation successfully, which is a problem we're still dealing with now.
Right.
But that starts with Stanford and Jane Lathrop Stanford and the Stanford fortune insulating itself from public control in this private institution. And it's important to remember that it's named for their son who dies, right? Leland Stanford Junior University. And it's the continuance of that inheritance throughout the West after the death of this child.
And like all good psychos during this time, Leland Stanford is interested in race science. Can you talk a bit about his relationship with eugenics? And also, it's fascinating, right? Like he was okay with certain people that he considered white, like Japanese people. Saw them as whiter, right, than the rest of other foreigners that he would have to deal with. it's just another. It's a bit of an aside, but you can kind of see how whiteness is constructed throughout history. But what was some of his relationship with debunked race science claims?
Yeah, well, the Leland Stanford era, they're really still trying to figure out what genes are, what breeding is. So horse breeding definitely is part of this prehistory of human eugenics. And that's sort of how he encounters David Starr Jordan, who they end up bringing out as the first president of Stanford University, from Indiana, University of Indiana, where he's a leading eugenicist around the world, right? And in the Stanford era, they were still trying to figure out what racial character meant and what they thought about that. And there's this old joke that the associates were talking about bringing Chinese workers over to build the railroad. And one of them said, well, do you think, I don't know if, Chinese workers are going to be capable of building this big railroad, whatever. And another one said, well, they did build a pretty big wall. We've got pretty good evidence that Chinese people can still build things.
Yeah.
And actually Chinese construction experience, millennia of Chinese construction experience actually becomes very important for building the railroad. And Leland Stanford ends up being very happy with the performance of these Chinese railroad workers. But into the 20th century, eugenics acquires this really important role in Stanford University with David Starr Jordan and the president of the university, who is an international figure when it comes to eugenics. And he really sets the school on this course to study eugenic science, bringing in more professors from Indiana University, including Vernon Kellogg and Lewis Terman, who ends up being one of the most important people in the history of Stanford University. Most famous for adapting a French IQ test into what we now call the Stanford-Binet IQ test, or just the IQ test, which really becomes the foundation for Stanford eugenics going forward.
Yeah, it is incredible how, we see this now with massive universities that have a lot of cachet, entertaining ideas that I think forward-thinking people know will be debunked or considered racist or facile in future decades, and yet that's kind of foundational for establishment academia and things of that nature. One thing that really struck me too is just turning back to the railroads and their role in the foundation of California. I wrote about corporate personhood and things of that nature in college, and the railroads in California birthed the Supreme Court's notion of corporate personhood in Santa Clara County Railroad versus Southern Pacific, right? Or I'm forgetting the exact case name. It was longer. But that was the origin of the notion that corporations could be treated as human beings under the 14th Amendment, which is the first step in what we saw culminating in a case like Citizens United, where now they have free speech rights that also equal money, which was established in Buckley v. Vallejo. But with California or Palo Alto being a laboratory for American capitalism, that's also one of the pillars of that.
Absolutely. And not just the legal precedent of corporate personhood, which you're right, comes out of Southern Pacific v. Santa Clara County, which is an aggregation of cases around the Southern Pacific and whether they could act like a person, whether they were entitled to rights. But even the concept of the corporation, the capitalist entity, as a personality, as something, or even a impersonal personality, as something larger than any family or group of people, is also of this period, right? And so we have the acknowledgement of impersonal forces as controlling and as dominating society and as dominating the relationship of people to society through these impersonal forces that are then personified in people like Leland Stanford. And we can see this in cartoons, where Leland Stanford is constantly represented in various super personal forms, like the octopus being the most famous one, where we still represent capital as an octopus, right? But that comes from the Southern Pacific, and ideas of these corporations as entities, right? Like acting entities as opposed to just collections of people.
Let's turn then to the 20th century, where California is getting Hollywood, right? But they're also getting the military-industrial complex, and a bunch of Cold War money kind of just explodes, and California is at the center of that. How was Palo Alto kind of positioned in this military-industrial complex boom? And how did that become what we know as, or feed into the big tech center that it is today?
Yeah, so Palo Alto is really engaged at the cutting edge of technology from the radio age. I mean, earlier, right? If we go back to the horses or whatever. But now, once we're talking about triodes and transistors and vacuum tubes, and once we enter in the radio age, Palo Alto is a center of invention. You've got the first radio station coming nearby in the South Bay, and you have the vacuum tube triode by Lee DeForest being invented. This is the precursor to the transistor. And there are pretty clearly obvious military implications of this technology for communications and avionics. So radar and putting electronics inside airplanes. But this early radio tech industry has a real fraught relationship with the federal government and with the military, which hasn't really figured out its relationship to the military-industrial complex, right? The military-industrial complex doesn't exist yet. Right now, you've got the federal government that says, we're the federal government. You know, you invented something cool. That's great. We're going to decide how it gets used and how it gets built and how it gets created. And in fact, you have to sell your company because your profits are too high as a percentage of your revenue. So you got to sell it to someone bigger who can fulfill this contract. And so this is actually a pretty traumatic memory, I think. It's a buried traumatic memory in the history of Silicon Valley, is when their companies got sort of taken by the federal government in the Roosevelt era. And the one company that really avoids this fate is Hewlett Packard. And they do that by basically David Packard, who's a 6'5" ex-Stanford football player, as well as this electronics entrepreneur supported by the school and inculcated with a very conservative ideology. When the federal government comes to him and says, look, you need to figure something out because we really like the things that you guys are producing. We're using them in the war, but your profits are too high and you're this unbalanced firm and we need you to play ball. And he just yells at him. He just yells at this guy, gets in his face and screams at him and says, I'm going to run my company however I want. I'm going to use my revenue to build my firm, and you can get the hell out. And that's basically, and according to his recollections of what happens, that's basically what happens. Like, they get a deal with the Fed. The Feds make an exception for Hewlett Packard. And this becomes the model for Silicon Valley, not just defense contracts or subcontracts, more accurately, but refusing to play ball according to a sort of Rooseveltian idea of collective interest. And after the war, after the death of Roosevelt, Hoover's still alive. Herbert Hoover, who's a Stanford grad and where the Stanford ideology comes from more than anyone, this political ideology. And that's the model for the interaction that the military-industrial complex sets up. Vannevar Bush, who's the founder of Raytheon, is also a Hoover associate, and he's really setting up this relationship between the federal government and these arms contractors and subcontractors. And this births Palo Alto, as we understand it in the 60s, as a place of the military-industrial complex, but a particular relation to it.
The Cold War relation, the increase in that kind of money, when did that begin to happen? And how does the anti-communism tilt fit into the broader kind of cowboy-esque capitalist mentality of Palo Alto?
Yeah, so it ties in right to what we were just talking about, that as soon as the war ends, Vannevar Bush, whose job it is to run the Office of Research and Scientific Development, is trying to figure out how they're going to do post-war military research and post-war financing for the research through the government. And he's working for Truman, but he's very consciously undermining Truman's efforts to house this within civilian parts of the government. And instead, he he's talking with Hoover personally at the same time,
Mm.
and he works to place funding for research within the military and within the Navy in particular, in the Office of Naval Research, and sets up this very close relationship with Stanford and with the Stanford for-profit arms subcontracting community that defines this Cold War era research. And so when we think of the Cold War era as like a big science, big government era, that's sort of an error, because the people who were setting it up, including Vannevar Bush, and the people who were benefiting from it, including Stanford, had this really Hooverian orientation that they were setting into motion, and I think successfully.
Right. I also find it intriguing that the Black Panther Party comes out of this area of the country in terms of the most amount of activity, right? It's almost the radicalization, the militancy of it compared to just the surplus of power and capital on the other side. I feel like there must be some sort of relationship between the two.
There is, right? And that's where doing this research has been so exciting and interesting. Is so Bobby Seale. Why is Bobby Seale in California? Why is he taking classes? Well, Bobby Seale works at Kaiser Aerospace. He's a military contractor worker, right? And he's taking classes at Merritt Community College in order to improve his education and be a better aerospace worker. Now, through that process, he encounters this political milieu and meets Huey Newton, and his whole life path changes. But it's important to understand that he was there working for the aerospace industry, right? He was there, part of these same historical trends that brought a lot of Black people to California for the first time, and brought a legacy of resistance and struggle that had won the Civil War from the South into California, really for the first time, and catalyzed this new movement and new sequence that really set the world on fire, right? Like the Panther Party, and not just the Panther Party, but other Panther-inspired militants in California, really inspired the whole world.
Right. And I know we're moving quickly, but I want to get to kind of more modern, the more modern history before we have to let you go. You have an out at 1. So Reaganism comes out of California too, right?
Yep.
And then we're now kind of more firmly in the beginning of tech as we know it in Palo Alto. And if I were to, off the top of my head, before reading your work, put like a marker down at a point where big tech became a modern example of enclosure and of just capitalist class kind of profit explosiveness. I'm not saying that well, but it would probably be around like Bill Gates' obsessive push to end open source. I know it started earlier than that, but I guess how does that kind of push by him fit into the larger expansion of Silicon Valley in this time?
Yeah, you can totally point to Bill Gates and the letter to hobbyists and him saying, look, you got to pay for our software. You can't just copy information. I own this information, and you got to license it from me. And his success doing that. But I think even it was just in dispute later than that, right? So like Napster exists. I'm old enough to remember Napster. I presume you're old enough to remember Napster. And so this idea of like, will the internet make everything free? Will the internet make everything shareable? Isn't really decided till I think the Bush administration. And when I went through the second Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, and I was surprised when I was really going through this work, how much support among tech that he had, because you think of Al Gore as the really pro-tech guy. You know,
he invented the internet.
Atari Democrat. He invented the internet. He can claim some real like knowledge about it or whatever. And so you think you have this big tech support, and you think of early, 90s, 2000 tech as very liberal, very progressive, socially progressive, not like Christian right or whatever.
Yeah.
But then you look at the reporting back then, and the tech industry was sort of split. And one of the things that they really liked about the George W. Bush administration, and what they ended up really liking about the George W. Bush administration, was John Ashcroft, who was the Attorney General. And you're smiling because those of us who were around remember that he was, the paragon of the Christian right. He was the god.
We
warrior.
have him singing on the soundboard. I can't reach it right now, but I can send it to you later on. It's a beautiful
right-wing Christian,
disaster.
10 Commandments, lawyer, anti-gay, bad dude, pro-tech, very, very pro-tech, back to his work in the 80s, writing pro-Betamax memos as a attorney general in Missouri, always pro-tech, regulatory wise, but also personally. And he comes up with this deal with the tech industry that basically says, you can do this whole accept conditions deal with your users, right? Whatever you want, as long as they accept it, click the I accept conditions button. You can violate whatever privacy rules, whatever, that's up to you. As long as you then sell us that information later so that the government can get around these same privacy rules. And this sets up the internet as we understand it now, right? John Ashcroft is the one who drops the antitrust suit against Microsoft, right? Microsoft is facing a very, very serious antitrust suit when the George W. Bush administration comes into office. Ashcroft drops it just straight up. No negotiation, just drops the case. And so the monopolist internet, the big tech internet that we understand, is really set up in this post 9/11, 9/11 era bargain between very right-wing, anti-privacy conservatives and the tech industry that sees the growth that they can achieve by being unregulated. And it's that synthesis. We don't think about that as the origin of the internet as we understand it now, but I think it really is.
Yeah, I mean well, we ended up having, of course, the Snowden revelations, and you kind of see how, well, it was telecommunications companies, but also some of these tech companies working so much in tandem with the war on terror effort. And it's also, despite the kind of socially liberal veneer of a place like Silicon Valley, the synthesis between the war on terror and the Bush administration is notable, but also the people that have come out of it at this point who were from that time period are all just weird freak libertarians, like Larry Ellison, who also, I think, had a close relationship with the Bush administration, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, go down the list. These guys are all of the same ilk, and fit so perfectly into the centuries-long kind of DNA of this part of the country. It's amazing.
Yeah, I think they could learn a lot about themselves from reading this book if they want to, right? I think some people think
self-reflection is not their forte.
Yeah, but the book at least tells a story that puts them at the center of modern history. So maybe they'd at least be flattered by that comparison. They can draw the line from Herbert Hoover or whatever. If I were them, I would be interested in this book. So I can leave it at that.
Right. Well, I'm so sorry to have run out of time with you. I really could have gone on for longer, but I know you're a busy guy. I couldn't recommend the book more highly. Malcolm Harris, journalist, author of Palo Alto, A History of California, Capitalism, and the World, and we will put a link in the descriptions below everywhere you're listening to this or watching. Thanks so much, Malcolm. Really appreciate it.
For having me, Emma. Have a good day.
Of course. All right, you too. All right, guys, with that, we are going to head into the fun half. Again, sorry for the sound issues earlier. I hope the interview sounded good. We're also having an issue with the IMs, although, okay, they're starting to come up again. So if you IM'd about the interview, send it again, because there was like a 20-minute blackout of instant messages on the app. But you can go and become a member so you can IM us. Join themajorityreport.com. For Matt in absentia, Left Reckoning, check that out. That was last night. I believe they were talking to, actually, I don't remember off the top of my head, but always a good show over there at Left Reckoning. They had a really interesting conversation about the Vietnam War that you should check out as well. I can personally recommend that one. And on ESVN today, Monday, who knows? We spoke about a lot of interesting topics, including the NBA's inclusion of Karl Malone during the All-Star weekend. Yeah, the guy that impregnated a girl when she was 12 years old. That Karl Malone, as well as Eric Bieniemy being forced to make a lateral move, plus assistant head coach, to Washington in order to get taken seriously as a head coaching candidate in a deeply racist hiring process, as well as a bunch of other things. So check it out, youtube.com/ESVN show. We talked a little hockey too as well, if you're interested. All right. With that, we're going to head into the fun half. We will be definitely taking some calls. 646-257-3920 is the phone number. Again, the show relies on your support. Join themajorityreport.com and then also check out our merch. The pre-sale for the M-Majority shirts has ended, unfortunately for you. But there's a lot of cool stuff. My sister messaged me the other day. She was like, can you get me this hoodie? It's so cool. The red one on shop.majorityreportradio.com. And I said, I don't know because I don't see one around the office, but I will try for you. So I have family members saying this merch is cool. So that means it is. All right, guys. Again, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
You are in for it. All right, folks. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half. Oh, no.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it to my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ Danner.
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. You see white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males...
Psych. Fuck them.
Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank.
All lives matter. Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are black. And the Africans are back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on! Fuck them. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday! Happy birthday to me, Jew boy!
I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are black. Africans are back.
Come on! Come on! Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
are back, everybody. It is myself, Emma Vigeland, and Bradley Alsop on the Majority Report. Just us two today. Matt's back tomorrow. Bradley's out Friday. It's his birthday. So we're again, what I'm saying, we're playing a bit of musical chairs here, but Bradley's celebrating his birthday for a long weekend. So that'll be fun for you. He's getting some sun. I won't say where you're